Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating. I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium. We'd like to thank you for joining us for the next in our series of compliance mandates and how they particularly apply to mobile. So before we dive in, I will give you the usual, as I love to say, and I get a hard time about it, perfunctory commentary. My mom is an English teacher, so I get to use words like that, even though I'm not the best at English, but the perfunctory stuff is we will make the slides available. We also will put an archive version of the webinar up on the site within a day or so. Please use the Q&A section. We try and keep these to about 20 minutes, maybe 25 of content, but we try to get you out of here before 30 minutes. If there are questions, great. If not, then we will just wrap up a little bit early, but please use the Q&A section. Even if you're having any technical difficulties, the chat stuff doesn't seem to work very well for us, so we like to keep things just in the Q&A section. So with that being said, obviously there's been some really interesting things happening this week with the Supreme Court ruling that Apple might have to deal with, as well as the WhatsApp vulnerability that came out. And I'll even touch on each one of those as we kind of roll through and talk about how that will apply to healthcare as well. So with that, let's dive in and specifically talk about HIPAA. I want to start off with some facts about mobile security and HIPAA, and then as we roll through the presentation, we'll kind of add a little bit more depth to some of these. The first one, and a lot of people don't realize this, as long as there's been HIPAA or HIPAA high tech, it has included mobile. So, and we've got a brief, by the way, if you'd like a little bit more detail on this, even outside the webinar, we have briefs on HIPAA, PCI, NERC, if you happen to be a healthcare company that deals with the electric grid, GDPR. We have a new one coming out with California Privacy Act. So those briefs will be available and provide some more information. But one of them is HIPAA has actually included mobile since 1996. Fact number two, pretty consistently across all of our customer base now, 60% of the devices accessing the data, in this case, healthcare related data in hospitals, dental offices, et cetera, are mobile. And so when you start talking about these endpoints, you start talking about some of the targets that hackers would go after. We'll talk about why that really, really matters, that 60% of your endpoints are mobile. They are under attack. We're going to talk about that. And that's where I'll also blend in some of the things, the recent news, like we said, from WhatsApp and some of the rest of that standpoint. The requirements are explicit. There are some compliance mandates where it's not as explicit, but in HIPAA's case, there are specific endpoint requirements. Now, one of the things I always like to tell people is there's a lot of companies that will go out and they will say, hey, buy our software and you're going to be instantly HIPAA compliant. They're lying. There is no one solution, software, hardware, physical, et cetera, to solve all of HIPAA. Doesn't make sense. So one of the things that we like to do here at Zimperium, we're known for being we are literally the worldwide leader in enterprise, business-focused mobile security. And so we understand that it's not going to be helpful to you for us to try and say that. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to get into the specific requirements that you need to look at when it comes to mobile, rather than, again, saying, hey, you know, wave a magic wand and all of a sudden, you know, you're completely covered, right? Because that just doesn't exist. And then number five, these webinars are not intended to dive deep into our product, but if we're going to set up the problem, we're going to set up the need. We'll take a few minutes to kind of say, okay, now here's why Zimperium is a solution for those explicit requirements that we were just talking about. So before we begin this whole thing, let's level set, and that is this: 100% of our customers. We say enterprise here, but it's also SMB, it's also federal, it's also SLED. 100% of our customers, including the healthcare ones, obviously by definition, because part of the 100%, detect threats. So there's, you know, a lot of people be like, well, I don't know, I haven't heard of any. And obviously with WhatsApp and these things in the press these days, then of course they have. But simple fact is, a lot of people don't know these attacks are occurring because they don't have anything on them to even detect whether or not there's a threat. So punchline, before we get into it, 100% of customers detect threats. And just to let you know, that's across thousands of customers and tens of millions of endpoints worldwide. So it's not like, oh, we got one customer and they detected threats. It's literally thousands of customers. So let's get over to this point. And this is one of the things that makes all the security professionals ride in their seats a little bit. And that is 60% of the endpoints are mobile. There's some time-tested security adages. One of them is land and expand. Bad guys will always find the weakest link to land, and then they're going to expand in. Right now, 60% of these endpoints are mobile. Most of them are controlled by the user, not by any kind of centralized system, because one of the important things to know, and we'll talk about this in the requirements, is there is no such thing as a centralized patch management system, for instance. It's up to the user on mobile to actually update. So when you have requirements that have to do with, you have to update, those are complicated in the mobile world because a lot of users won't update their devices because they might slow it down or whatever the case may be. And so now you're going to have an exposure to your audits. One of the things that we like to talk about sometimes is the only hacker you're going to face is an auditor. And so they're going to come rolling in and they're going to be checking these things. And if everybody's out of date, for instance, then then obviously that's going to be an issue when it comes to your audits. So it is important to say that mobile is just another endpoint. An endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. If I've got patient data sitting on a tablet, it's no different than if I've got patient data sitting on a laptop or a server. You need to be able to address them. But to the point that we were just talking about, right now, all of the money we've spent on endpoint security covers 40% of the endpoints that are subject to HIPAA at this point in time. So literally 40% are traditional laptops, servers, everything on those lines. 60%, these new mobile devices that are in the hands of these users that quite often, depending on the use case, are spending 80% of their time outside of your protected corporate firewall, have no visibility on them whatsoever. And as I was mentioning from the land and expand standpoint, that's why the bad guys are going there, right? NSO group, allegedly with the WhatsApp, perfect example. Why did they go there instead of going after the laptop? Well, it's easy today. So I'm not going to sit here and give accolades to somebody like NSO for what I refer to as a BSO or a BFO, a blinding flash of the obvious. Why not go to these endpoints that have no protection on them today? So like I said, this really makes endpoint security guys uncomfortable. One of the big sea changes we've seen over the last couple of years is it used to be that it was only the mobility teams that were involved in these decisions. Now the security teams are actually running it. So it's important to note along those lines. So I mentioned mobile endpoints are under attack. It's important to know that there are some things that are different about mobile than traditional endpoints, and it changes the composition a little bit of what you need to look for with the threats. So there's basically four major buckets. There's hundreds of variations of this, but four major buckets of threats. Everybody always thinks about malicious apps. Everyone talks about malware, things on those lines. The fact is, in mobile, all apps are in what are called containers. That means each app is in its own little bucket. In traditional endpoints, an app could come in and it could go sideways through other apps to become persistent. I mentioned land and expand is one of the rules of security that is time tested. Another one is persistence. The bad guys are bad dudes, but they're very good at what they do. And they have a very efficient business model. And one of the parts of that business model, the ROI, the return part, for as long as they've been doing this, once they take over a system, they want to remain persistent on that system for as long as humanly possible. In the old world that we came from, and I've been in endpoint security for 20 years, they would, quite often, the servers or the desktops that were the cleanest, in quotes, in terms of patch levels and signature updates and all the rest of that stuff, were ones that had already been compromised. And the reason was because the bad guys had already taken it. They didn't want to be discovered by having it stick out to the security team. but they also didn't want to get, like, have a glitch in their whole plan by having some script kiddie come in and try and knock them off. So the objective of being persistent has always been there. In mobile, because all apps are in containers, the only way to be persistent and to weaponize the device, in this case, we're going after patient data and or in the future going after medical devices and the like, is to actually compromise the device. You can't just keep moving around from app to app because then you've never broken out of a container. The only way to own it is to truly own the device. So we're the enterprise security guys. We knew from the very beginning that everybody, in order to be persistent, the bad guys were going to compromise the device. That is the sole objective. Malware is basically for fraud. The vast majority of all malware is nothing but untargeted fraud. Now, can an app potentially deliver an exploit to compromise the device? Yes, it can. Mobile phishing is a real issue. 90% of breaches, according to Verizon and multiple other sources, start with a phishing attack. Well, 2/3 of emails are read on mobile now, which means mobile phishing is a real issue. And you can get away with a lot more. Smaller screen size, people much more likely to click on it. People are much more likely to be on mobile. I might open my personal email and get phished, and yet now the corporate side is exposed. So phishing is a real issue. And even though it's untargeted again, from a company standpoint, because that's what we're designed to do, is protect the healthcare institution in this case, one of your employees could actually get it. And as I said, similar to the malicious app side, it could deliver a compromise. But here's the key. We knew our job is to protect healthcare institutions from being attacked directly, what's called a targeted attack. Somebody's going after XYZ healthcare system, right? A bad guy is not going to drop an app in the app store and pray that somebody downloads it. What they're going to do is they're going to sit in a coffee shop across from XYZ's main hospital, main facility, wait for somebody from XYZ to come in, attach themselves to this fake Wi-Fi network they've set up, and deliver an exploit. In fact, when you look at the data, and this is consistent across all industries, consistent worldwide, roughly 90% of all targeted attacks start with a network attack because it's the most efficient. As I said, these guys are very good at what they do. And so the most efficient way of targeting an institution is to set it up, and smartphones are so dumb that they'll actually do this. Now, I mentioned a couple things in the news this week. Apple. Supreme Court ruled that consumers can sue Apple to allow them to be able to get apps from someplace other than the App Store. Where that might sound great from a user selection standpoint, our data verifies that there's about 1/10 as much malware on iOS as there is on Android. So we've been asked by a lot of reporters and the like, what are our take on this? We're not weighing in on the political part of this whole thing, but what we are saying is the facts are the facts. There is significantly more malware on Android than there is on iOS, and the vast majority of the malware on Android comes from third-party app stores. So this will be an interesting thing to watch. The other thing that's been in the news has been the WhatsApp vulnerability and WhatsApp communication solution from Facebook that billions of people around the world use. And the key part behind that whole thing, without going off on a whole tangent, because I'm sure we'll end up probably doing a webinar just on this, we're already writing blogs on it, all the rest of the fun stuff. The key part is what it is. The guys that were allegedly behind it, the NSO group, are known for creating exploits on mobile specifically to compromise the device, this column on the left. So in this particular case, they were taking advantage of a hole in a well-known solution in billions of users to be able to deliver an exploit to take over a device, be able to record conversations, be able to do everything else. And it's been noted that the first person that this was detected on was a lawyer that's actually involved in a lawsuit against the NSO group. So that is a perfect example of a targeted attack. Now, is there any reason if somebody was targeting XYZ Bank, they couldn't do the exact same, or XYZ Healthcare? No, that's exactly. And so why? Because what do the bad guys want? They want credentials, they want data, and they want to weaponize the device. They want to be persistent. Data, of course, in this case, if we were talking about a hamburger chain, maybe they would have to worry about something like, PCI. But in your case, in healthcare, it's obviously all patient data. Now, it might be get credentials in order to subsequently get data. It might be weaponize the device to be able to go inside the network to get data. But fundamentally, in your guys' case, it's all about data today. In the future, it might be about weaponization. It might be about delivering ransomware to medical devices and the like. But that's in the future. So mobile is an endpoint. 60% of the endpoints that are out there, they're actively being attacked. The ultimate goal, of course, is to compromise the device. So let's talk about HIPAA in particular. And I mentioned, I was kind of joking about the only hacker you're going to face is an auditor. One of the things that I think is important is, depending on the requirement, the different compliance mandates, they will ask for certain things. Some of them will be prescriptive, like you must prevent malware. Others will be more descriptive. Here is how we expect you to prevent malware. So when we look at the HIPAA requirements specifically as it pertains to endpoints, the majority of them, there's some others that we didn't include because they're like, we kind of help a little bit here. But the main part, if you look at mobile as an endpoint, you say, what are the endpoint threat detection, risk detection requirements? The majority of them fall under 164.308. And as you kind of roll down, and I'm not going to read each one of them, that would be pretty boring. But this is on our website under the compliance section. And as I mentioned, there's a brief. But if you've done endpoint security, you're probably familiar with them. The difference is, how do we apply that to mobile because of some of the differences, like the user being the admin, like no centralized patch management system, et cetera. So if you kind of look at like the first one and the last one, and even the second to last one, a lot of those have to do with, you need to be able to detect if something is attacked in the device, and then you need to be able to provide that data and act on it, right? So with 60% of these devices having no visibility at all, that's kind of hard to do, right? So by having a solution like ours that detects the risks and detects the threats, puts it directly into your SIM solution or whatever other solution you want to use, you can right off the bat have visibility and the ability to respond to those to the auditor. Now, if you look at A5, the periodic security updates, as I mentioned, there is no patch management system. But what you do need is, again, tell me all the devices that are on outdated operating systems. Not only does Zimperium tell you which ones are on outdated operating systems, in particular on Android, because the patch management, the patch development and propagation process is very different on Android than on iOS. In iOS, Apple controls the operating system, and Apple has direct relationship with the carrier. So when Apple decides to put out a patch, it's on the phones immediately, and boom, it's done. For Google, if they patch, which, by the way, there were 700, I think, security vulnerabilities between the two of them last year. So there's a lot of them. The last one that just came out from Apple was 42. Ronnie Lott's number, by the way, for 49er fans. But so there's a lot of these things coming out. On Android, Google will produce the patch, but they have to get it to each of the handset manufacturers. Each of the handset manufacturers have to, for each of their devices, get it down to the carriers. So there's almost always a lag. So one of the things that we do uniquely, because again, we're the enterprise guys, we understand this, is we will not only tell you which ones are out of date, we'll also tell you which ones are on phones that are out of date that can't be updated yet. So that you're not running around or constantly getting alerts that you can't do anything with yet. And then when the patch becomes available, they're now upgradable, right? And then we also have really good information about all the CVEs, the vulnerability behind each and every one of them, so you can decide which ones are big threats or not. When we get down to 5.2b instead of A, that's all about detecting threats, right? And as I mentioned, you could check the box instead of securing your boxes by just putting out a malware solution. But the reality is, if you're really trying to protect yourself and really trying to prevent against glitches, you want to have something that not only detects malware, but also detects device compromises, phishing, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the list of the HIPAA requirements that need to be addressed. Briefly, very briefly, why are we the solution? Well, let's start back at this as a reminder. 90% of the targeted attacks begin as a network attack. Why does that matter? Why that matters is this. That means 9 times out of 10, the hacker controls the network. And if the hacker controls the network, the first thing they're going to do, if you have a cloud-based mobile detection solution, they're going to cut off access to that cloud. Because there's no reason for them to allow that device that they've compromised to be able to talk to the thing that's going to detect them. That's dumb. Which is why Zimperium has always been on device. And now the industry is catching up. Even Gartner says, as you can read, the on-device agent provides a better likelihood of protection persisting over a compromised network. For Gartner, that's about as strong of a statement on a specific technology approach as you're going to get. Simple fact is, if you are going to protect that device for a targeted attack and you're protecting the enterprise, you have to be able to do all of your detection on device, not relying on the cloud. In Zimperium's case, we have one engine, it's called Z9. I like to joke that like BMW is an engine company, not a car company, and it produces engines. We have one engine that can be utilized in different ways. Z9 is machine learning to detect both known and unknown threats, device network phishing, malicious apps on device. It's actually trained up in the lab. So all the machine learning training, heavy lifting, everything is up in the lab. Once we figure out what are the right system elements that equal a certain threat, like a device attack, an elevation of privilege, whatever the case may be, that small little classifier is put down on the device. That way it's able to detect on device, even if the bad guy owns a network, with very little footprint, like very little footprint, like 1% battery, sort of thing. So Z9 can be rolled out in one of two ways. If you're trying to protect the device and all the data on the device 100% of the time, just like next generation antivirus for mobile, it's a product called ZIPS, which stands for Z Intrusion Prevention System. If, however, you have a mobile app, you can, with an SDK that we've got, software development kit, drop Z9 directly into a mobile app. In that case, you're not protecting the device 100% of the time. You're protecting the app and the session that app has. So from a healthcare example, you might be using ZIPS to protect all of the devices that your doctors, nurses, et cetera, are using. Whereas if you have a consumer-facing app that has patient data, you would drop Z9 in that to make sure that if the patient's device is compromised, if the patient is sitting on a bad Wi-Fi network or has malware, you can adjust what information you're going to deliver to them, setting you light years ahead of your counterparts when it comes to meeting HIPAA requirements. Both of those, because we do all of our detection on device, our console, Z console, which is where all the management stuff flows into, you can put it on any cloud you want. The guys that have locked their detection into the cloud have to pick one cloud solution. We believe you should do whatever cloud you want. So we're completely cloud agnostic. For people that are hypersensitive, we can even do on-prem. And that's all a benefit of being the enterprise-focused guys, but the benefit of doing the detection on device. Behind Z console is a capability we have called Z3A, which stands for Advanced App Analysis. There's apps that are perfectly legitimate, but have security and privacy risks in them. Perfect example of this week, WhatsApp, right? So WhatsApp is a perfectly legitimate app, but it can be used by the bad guys right now because of some holes in it to be able to cause chaos. So using something like Z3A, you would say, hey, show me all my devices that have WhatsApp and what version, the specific version of WhatsApp that's vulnerable. And now we're going to set policies to actually say, look, until you upgrade WhatsApp or take it off your device, you don't get access to email. And you can do things on those lines. We also connect in with the broadest set of EMMs. We're the only guys that can handle multiple EMMs in a single tenant. Mobile Iron, in their particular case, actually took ZApp and embedded it directly in the Mobile Iron agent. So if you're a Mobile Iron customer, you can actually have instant on 100% protection without having to do any additional work because it's already in the Mobile Iron agent. Then, as I mentioned, especially to meet all those logging requirements of HIPAA, we put all of this information, the greatest level of forensics that any mobile security solution has, directly into your SIM of choice or McAfee EPO, things on those lines. So that's the end of the product stuff. It's actually the end of the formal part of the presentation. And I will stop and see if we have any questions. And if not, then we can wrap things up. So I don't see any specific questions. For anybody that is interested, in a consultation, we're more than happy to sit down. We have a bunch of healthcare customers. It's HIPAA is driving a significant amount of interest in this, as it should. And so feel free to hit us on the contact us part of our site if you'd like a consultation. Also, please don't, if you're so inclined, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, especially to keep up with things like the Apple discussion we've had, WhatsApp, and whatever else is coming along the lines as well. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for your time and hope you have a fantastic day.